Chapter 31, Revolution, Rebuilding, and New Challenges, 1985 to present. The final chapter of our year together is going to begin with the decline of communism in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, particularly culminating in the year 1989, which, like 1789, is a critical revolutionary year in European history. 1789, of course, is the year that the French Revolution started and really shook the foundations of old regime Europe, and 1989 is the end of communism and the beginning of a new era for Europe and the West. Section A, the Soviet Union to 1985. The 1968 crushing of the Prague Spring Rebellion, really uprising, by Brezhnev indicated that the Soviets were unwilling to allow any reforms in society. They were maintaining their power and status quo at any price, crushing of any type of reform that called for basic personal freedoms or political freedoms. So that was a critical moment. From that point and for the next 12 years, no one really tried that again. And in the 1970s, even though this was allegedly the era of détente, which we learned about in the last chapter, there was a lot of areas in Soviet society that were really going back to a Stalinist-style regime. The art and culture of the Soviet Union was once again censored heavily. Any form of dissent, people that were dissenters often were blacklisted, which means that they were put on a list and they could never get a job again in the Soviet Union. So they would either have to leave the country or basically go into hiding. Brezhnev was never as bad as Stalin, but society was definitely moving sort of back in that direction. However, there were some signs of change in the 1970s. Two-thirds of Soviet citizens lived in a big city by the time we get to that decade. And once they're in those cities, there were lots of technical experts and scientists and educated people that were producing things so valuable to the Soviets, like national defense, nuclear weapons, the different things they cared about so much. There were lots of educated people, and these people started to talk among themselves in cities as they gathered together. And there was some increasing political and social debate happening kind of under the table, not out in public, but in private. There were lots of people calling among each other for change. The story of the end of communism really, though, begins in Poland. 12 years after the Prague Spring Rebellion was crushed, it's now 1980, and in Poland, the story begins. Poland was always considered the unruly satellite of the Eastern Bloc. They never were a fully Stalinist-style nation. The people of Poland, the political leaders there, never implemented the type of censorship and military regime and spying on the people that they had in the Soviet Union. So it's never quite been a full-scale communist nation. They had loved independence after World War I when it was recreated, and there was always an edge of independence to the people of Poland. The communists, therefore, in that nation over the 30 years since World War II, failed to crush the Catholic Church. They never really banned religion, and they never really managed the economy well either. A real turning point is actually the election of Pope John Paul II, who is a Polish pope, the first ever pope from Eastern Europe, elected in 1978. And the new pope, leading the Catholic Church, became a real leader in the struggle against communism as he banded together and gave support to some political activists in Poland that were struggling to fight against communism. So we move to that story. In the 1980s, there's a shipyard workers movement, a movement of guys that build ships, big, strong, blue-collar guys. And they start to ask for a union in 1980. And to ask for their union, they go on strike. 16,000 ship workers went on strike in Gdansk, which is a city in Poland, at their shipyards. And they asked for basic things that we would consider basic, but were quite radical for that time. Freedom of speech, the right to form a union, the freedom to assemble peacefully, the release of political prisoners. And these guys wanted economic reforms, and they got it. The Polish government agreed to what's called the Gdansk Agreement, which you will read during class, 21 different demands for mostly economic and some political changes. The leader of this movement is a man named Lech Walesa, who becomes a very prominent person in the story of the end of communism. By 1980-81, the movement, which is known as Solidarity, the labor union is formed, it's legalized, and these guys are known as Solidarity, and they have 9.5 million members from Poland, and they become kind of a national voice of the people. It starts off as an economic thing, a labor union, and it ends up in becoming a political party. So it makes a dramatic transformation from something quite limited to something really large. And because it starts to get large and threatening to the communist regime in Poland, they outlawed this union and political party called Solidarity. They outlawed it in 1981, but it really continued underground, which means in secret. And it never went away, and the people of Poland had had a brief taste of freedom. Poland is like the first domino that falls, and it's going to knock over the rest of Eastern Europe once we hit 1989. And again, this union providing real and symbolic leadership against communism throughout the 1980s in Eastern Europe. Let's move forward. Section C, Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union. Everything changes in the 1980s in communism because of one man, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was the new leader of the Soviet Union starting in 1985. He was young, he was open-minded, he was more liberal, he wanted to make some changes to the system. The system had created apathy in the masses, the incredible layers of communist bureaucracy, the shortages, the long lines to buy food, to have the inability to get decent housing, the stagnant economy. These are all very real problems that were happening in the Soviet Union that Gorbachev actually said he would deal with. There were two quick leaders that followed Brezhnev. Both of them died very rapidly. The names are in your notes. They didn't make any changes, but by the time we got to 1985, Gorbachev and his stated goal is to save communism by reforming it. He said we need to end the arms race with the U.S. He knew they were losing. It was costing them too much money to keep up. He also attacked things that had become commonplace in the Soviet Union, such as corruption in the government, an incompetent bureaucracy led by people that were uneducated, and maybe most importantly, alcoholism and self-destructive behavior on the part of most Russian people throughout the communist era. His two major reforms, you have to know these terms, perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika means economic restructuring, and this was his economic system of reform, and it called for simply getting rid of price controls, getting rid of government mandated, the government set the prices of everything. So let's allow the market to determine the price of goods rather than the government. He allowed a very limited form of capitalism where you could set up what they called a cooperative, not a business, a cooperative that you could actually make a profit running. So limited experiments with people kind of running their own businesses. The end of price controls again, very basic stuff. These didn't work at first, but they opened the door, and once the door is open, it won't shut. His other policy, glasnost, means social and political openness. This is more of the political rights side of the equation. And he said that people had basic rights of free speech. They could debate. They could read books that criticized their country for the first time. He allowed plays to be written and performed that criticized Soviet society. Something like free speech and free expression is what people were given. The third thing is democratization. And the main thing that he allowed was he allowed the people of the Soviet Union to see politicians debating each other in the Soviet parliament, which was run by all communists, but he allowed there to be debate. And then ultimately he opened free elections within the Communist Party itself. But even the idea of voting for someone, even within the Communist Party, was enough to really push things forward. Again, perestroika is the economic policy. Glasnost was the social and political freedom that he offered, all in the effort to save communism by reforming it. Gorbachev was, and as far as I know, still is, a believer in communism. He was not an American-style politician, but he wanted to save his nation. His maybe most important policy of all in terms of the rest of Europe was his refusal to crush dissenters in Eastern Europe. This is new. He got rid of the Brezhnev doctrine. He said it's too expensive. We can't be the policeman of Eastern Europe anymore. We have enough problems at home. We're not going to stop reform in Eastern Europe. So this opens the door tremendously. His foreign policies were called New Thinking. It's a new approach to dealing with the West. Get out of Afghanistan. That's his first move. Second move, reduce the nuclear weapons stockpile in the Soviet Union and weapons production to try to save them money. Encouraging reform movements to follow like his. He said you need to have your own versions of perestroika and glasnost across Eastern Europe if we're all going to survive. Maybe, and then the last part of New Thinking is working closely with the West, the U.S. particularly, and President Ronald Reagan. Gorbachev and Reagan held many meetings over the 3 or 4 years that they were in power at the same time. They were called summits. They would meet in third-party nations around the world, and they signed various agreements to reduce nuclear weapons and cooperate on different issues. So they sort of developed a mutual respect, not quite a friendship, but at least a mutual respect for one another at that point. All right, here we go. The story of the end of communism. The dominoes start falling, and they start falling in Poland. Again, 1989, a critical year. You must memorize that. The collapse of communism, all is 1989. Starts in Poland. It's an 8-year process. So we were talking about solidarity in the early 1980s. By 1989, the Polish economy was in a state of disaster, and the Polish Communist Party leaders legally recognized solidarity in the labor union again and as a political party, and they needed their help to try to get the economy of Poland going again. They agreed as a concession to allow free election. The Communist Party agreed to have free elections called for June of 1989, and the political party started off as labor union called Solidarity won a majority of the seats in this first free election in a long time in Poland. And then, amazingly, here he is, our man, Lech Walesa, the shipyard worker turned labor union leader, now politician, is chosen as the first president of Poland. What a story from the bottom all the way to the top. It's an incredible story of triumph and persistence. He had been jailed for a long time in the 1980s. He was a political dissident. He had a rough go of it, and he eventually rises up to become the first president of a free Poland. They started off slowly in the political, in terms of political change. They got rid of the secret police, but they were careful not to, make their neighbors angry, and they were still a little concerned that maybe Soviet tanks would roll in, just like had happened in the past. So they were a little bit slow on the political change, but economically they went fast. It's called shock therapy. They want to convert to capitalism as soon as possible. We've got to get free markets going. We've got to get rid of government planning and government ownership of business, and we got to get into a free market as quickly as possible. So they called it the Big Bang. On January 1st, 1990, the government basically changed over. Price control stopped, and the whole system switched over incredibly fast. And we're going to hear in the later part of the chapter some of the troubles that actually led to. So to sum up Poland, the process was started by political leaders through the Solidarity, first labor union, then political movement, and it led to free elections and the electing of Lech Walesa as the first president of Poland. All happened in the summer of 1989. The second country, the second domino, so to speak, to fall is in Hungary. They followed Poland's lead. They elected a reform-minded communist leader was chosen, kind of like the Gorbachev of Hungary, and he agreed to free elections. Same summer, same year, and one of the first things they did was they decided to open their border to East German refugees. They opened the border to allow anyone from East Germany to come into Hungary, and then when we look at a map here in a minute, they were able to escape into Austria, and from Austria into West Germany. So here's a picture of the guy who's taking down literally the fence between, known as the Iron Curtain, the border fence between Austria and Hungary. And here's how they did it. Look at this map. People in East Germany, of course, always wanted to go into West Germany. People in East Berlin always wanted to get into West Berlin. So what would happen is that the East Germans would say they were going on vacation. was allowed. They actually could leave East Germany, but they had to stay behind the Iron Curtain. So they could go on vacation, so to speak, into Poland or Czechoslovakia, but they would go down to Hungary. Hungary had now taken down its borders with Austria, so the people could actually just escape, literally run across the border into Austria and take refuge there, or just go from Austria right back into West Germany. So it was a long train. How to get out from behind the Iron Curtain? You had to go through three different nations in the way to get from East Germany to West Germany. But this is now an opening in the Iron Curtain, and thousands of people became refugees, and they fled East Germany for this several day, maybe even week, 2 week trip to get over to the West. It's amazing. The third country that falls was East Germany itself. So for most of the 1980s and 70s, the leader was Erich Honecker, who's one of these old-time communist guys that refused any change. And so the story here is going to be even more dramatic when the political leaders resisted change. The people of East Germany take the lead. So much like the political leaders in Poland took the lead, but in East Germany, it's the average people through protest movements in the streets and through leaving the country really are the ones that initiate reform in East Germany. So you've got the stayers and the leavers. The leavers I just talked to you about, the hundreds of thousands who were getting out of the country through Hungary. This drew a lot of international attention. It was on TV, people knew this was happening. And then there were the stayers, the people that decided to go into the streets of East Germany, particularly in the cities of Leipzig and then ultimately Berlin, East Berlin, protesting every night for months for political and social freedom, and then obviously hoping that that would lead to economic betterment for them. Gorbachev, witnessing all of these protest movements and the thousands that were leaving the country, announced, consistent with his policies, that the Soviet Union would not intervene in East Germany. They would not send in troops to protect Honecker and these, old-time East German communists. Honecker was tossed out of office by his own party for being inflexible, and he was replaced with a younger member named Egon Krenz, Krenz, and this guy was a little bit more willing to make a few changes. One of the first things they did, and it was sort of an accident, there was some miscommunication among the East German government. They opened the wall, they opened the gates between East Berlin and West Berlin on the evening of November 9th, 1989. And hundreds of thousands of people from East and West Berlin came to the border to meet each other for the first time. It was sort of again, it wasn't really their intention. That somebody misread a communication that was sent, and these border guards opened the gates. And thousands of people went back and forth that night between East and West Berlin freely for the first time in almost 30 years, maybe even since World War II, almost 40. Very quickly thereafter, there was a giant party on the top of the Berlin Wall that went on for days as the border guards basically refused to fire on the protesters. The government ordered the borders open, so the wall was meaningless. And for many, many days in a row, thousands of people stood on the wall, danced on the wall, drank champagne together, hugged, kissed, started hammering at it with hammers, trying to break it down. It was one of the world's greatest parties. And it's this critical year of 1989, the 9th of November and the following days in East Germany and East Berlin. So here's pictures of the wall coming down. Incredible scenes, transformation, in terms of human history. This is one of these moments that really, if you were alive, you'll never forget it. And if you study it, you'll know how important it is. Lots of partying, lots of, helping each other get up there. And within days, as you see here, they started to demolish the wall, so they were taking sections down very quickly. There's the Brandenburg Gate, famous symbol of Germany, which was right on the edge of East and West Berlin. So the wall starts to come down, and if you go to Berlin today, you'll notice that the wall is totally gone, and they've replaced it with simply a row of bricks. And you can follow the path of the Berlin Wall all over the city through this row of bricks. So Berlin is a totally transformed city in the last 20 years, 25 years really, and it looks nothing like it did when the wall was there. They've renovated it. They've built giant public squares where the wall used to be. It's a beautiful city today, all because of the events of 1989. So free elections are held to finish up the page. The communists, of course, are thrown out, and Germany is waiting to be reunited. The fourth story, the fourth domino to fall, is Czechoslovakia. And the events here, the end of communism here, is known as the Velvet Revolution. It's December 1989, so it's just a month after the fall of the Berlin Wall. This story is marked by being probably the most peaceful of any of these stories that we're telling today. It starts with a similar movement to Solidarity, but it's led by a man named Václav Havel, and it's called Civic Forum. And these guys were intellectuals, so the intellectuals of Czechoslovakia led the charge here. Václav Havel was a poet and a playwright. He was an actor, and he would meet in coffee shops in Prague throughout the 1980s. And Civic Forum was this underground dissident movement that was all about political, social, and intellectual freedom. They weren't a labor union. They weren't really, economics was not their goal, but personal, political, social freedom was. And so he and his associates, these very well educated guys, were having these underground meetings throughout the 80s. He was jailed for a while. He was caught, thrown in jail. But eventually, as the tide of history changes, there starts to be massive protests in the streets of Prague. And the same thing, the Communist Party, sensing that they better, say yes or risk their own life, allowed free elections. And of course, they're out, and they're replaced by Civic Forum. And so Václav Havel, much like Lech Walesa in Poland, was elected the first president of a new Czechoslovakia. And here he is up on the balcony in Wenceslas Square, which is the center square in Prague, right after the Communist Party had resigned. Hundreds of thousands of people in the streets cheering him on. Another amazing story from bottom to top, the Velvet Revolution. Now, a couple years later, the two nations were created out of Czechoslovakia peacefully. There's different cultures. There's actually two different languages. These two different ethnic groups, and they had been put together in one country after World War I by the people at the Treaty of Versailles, and they realized that they really would prefer to be in two separate nations. So the nation had essentially a divorce. We call it the Velvet Divorce, and it was also peaceful. So there was no civil war as the country split into two, and this happened by January 1st, 1993. The Velvet Revolution, followed by the Velvet Divorce. Peaceful events in Czechoslovakia. The fifth and last story for today is the story of the end of communism in Romania. Romania was the most violent end to communism of all the stories. Its dictator from 1965 to 89 was an evil Stalinist-style guy named Nicolae Ceausescu, who lived a life of absolute luxury while the people of Romania were starving and had nothing. And they made just pennies for wages, and this guy lived sort of like a god. He had a cult of personality around him that was stronger than anybody in the communist Eastern Europe except for Stalin. The citizens of Romania were watched more closely by secret police than anywhere else. The secret police force in Romania was the largest anywhere in Eastern Europe. This guy's he's living in the 1930s, essentially trying to keep that going. And so, protest movement started in Romania in December of 1989 in a city called Timișoara, which is hard to spell, but Timișoara, which is the capital is Bucharest, but this was sort of another city nearby. And Ceausescu ordered his troops to fire on the protesters, and they did. Thousands of people were killed in these initial waves of protest in Romania. Back in the capital city, protests had spread to the main central square called Palace Square, and they had heard about events in this neighboring city, and they came into the square, and by the thousands. The dictator Ceausescu thought that these people were actually coming to support him, so he came out onto this balcony to give a speech to the crowd, which was carried on live TV, and he thought he'd use this moment to talk about the future of the Communist Party in Europe. He didn't make any reference to this massacre that he had ordered against protesters. And about 8 minutes into this guy's speech, which had typically been totally scripted, and the crowds were there to obediently, cheer for him and never say a word, 6 minutes in, the crowd turned against him and started shouting and booing and making a disruption, something unlike this guy had ever been used to. And it was all being carried on live TV. The crowd literally turned against him. So he starts to put his hand up and try to calm the crowd down, and like an old grandfather, hey, be quiet, you kids. And the people just started shouting even more. His secret service, his secret police agents, you can see in this back here, came out and rushed out onto this balcony and whisked him away, took him into the palace. They thought he might maybe be assassinated from the crowd. They put him in a helicopter on the roof of the government building here, and he flew away. He escaped from this mob that was about to break in to the palace. Very much sounds like the French Revolution, doesn't it? With the storming of the Bastille and the Women's March to Versailles, and they wanted to get into the palace and get the king and queen. They almost got this guy too, except he got out by helicopter. The protesters took over the building. They took over the TV stations. The army quickly turned against Ceausescu and started joining the protesters. Again, so just like maybe in the Russian Revolution when the Communist Party was coming to power, the Tsar had ordered the troops to fire on the crowd, and they reversed that and joined the crowd instead. So similar kind of things where loyalties are changing literally in a moment's notice. The Ceausescus, he and his wife, these two old people, these old man and old lady, were caught as they were escaping. They were caught in a suburb out there. The new protesters that had, in the military that had now joined the protesters held a show trial for them, lasted an hour. They found them guilty of crimes against humanity, and they were executed on the spot. And here's the crowd taking over tanks. The army joins the protesters, and now the people are driving around in tanks. It's anarchy, but it's good anarchy because it overthrew a really bad dictator. And here he is. They killed him on Christmas Day, 1989, the end of communism in Romania. We'll stop here for this section, and the next section we'll deal with is the fall of communism in the Soviet Union.